Driving the night shift for a small town's rideshare service has its perks. Minimal traffic, decent tips from lonely night owls, and plenty of quiet stretches. I kept to myself, sticking to main roads, avoiding dark alleys or abandoned neighborhoods. It was around 2 a.m. when the request came in. The pickup location wasn't far. A quiet road just past the edge of town. I didn't recognize the address, but that was normal in a town full of winding roads and strange back streets. As I pulled up, I saw him, a man standing alone under the streetlight, face partially hidden in shadow. He wore a dark coat, hat pulled low, and no luggage. Just him and the quiet. He climbed in the back without a word, shutting the door softly. "Hey," I greeted, trying to gauge him through the rearview mirror. No response. I chalked it up to a late night and an unfriendly passenger. People in this job didn't always chat, and that was fine with me. His destination was on the other side of town, out near the old quarry. The roads were narrow and dark, no signs or lights beyond the glow of my headlights. Every now and then, I'd glance in the mirror, but he sat perfectly still, eyes staring out the window, expression unreadable. We'd been driving for nearly 20 minutes when I realized I couldn't remember any landmarks. I knew these roads, and yet they seemed unfamiliar, the trees leaning in too close, casting twisted shadows in the headlights. "Did you, change the destination?" I asked, finally breaking the silence. He didn't answer, didn't even blink. I swallowed, feeling a prickling sense of dread. The car's GPS showed a route, but it seemed wrong, constantly adjusting, pointing me deeper into winding back roads I'd never seen. Eventually, I pulled over, heart racing. "Sir, I think something's wrong with the GPS. Are you sure you want to go out here?" This time, he looked at me, his gaze sharp and cold. "You took the wrong road." His voice was barely a whisper, but it hit me like a gust of icy wind. My heart skipped a beat. I turned to face him, but the back seat was empty. The door hadn't opened, the interior lights hadn't flickered. He was just gone. A chill settled over me as I looked around. Nothing, just the empty car, the quiet night, and me, sitting there alone. I took a few deep breaths, forcing myself to think rationally. Maybe he'd slipped out, maybe he'd walked off while I wasn't looking, but something in my gut told me that wasn't the case. I'd been looking right at him, and now he wasn't there. I checked the app. His ride request had disappeared too. No trace of his name, no fare logged. It was as if he'd never existed. Shaking, I turned the car around and drove back to town, resisting the urge to look in the rearview mirror. Every rustling leaf, every shadow cast by the headlights, felt like it was watching me, following me. I returned to the main roads, almost relieved to see the familiar gas station lights, even at this ungodly hour. I pulled over, needing a break. As I got out, a clerk stepped out for a smoke, nodding at me. "Tough night, huh?" he asked, eyeing my pale face. "You could say that," I replied, shoving my hands in my pockets. "Weird ride just now." "Yeah? Who'd you pick up?" he asked casually, taking a drag. "Some guy out past the edge of town, creepy as hell, vanished halfway through the ride." The clerk's expression changed, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. Was he wearing a dark coat, hat pulled low? My blood ran cold. "Yeah. How did you know?" He chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "You're not the first. People have been seeing him for years. He'll keep calling rides, showing up just past the edge of town. They call him the lost passenger." I felt a chill settle deep in my bones. "So what? He's some kind of ghost?" The clerk shrugged. "Or something like it. They say he's looking for something, but he never finds it." Reluctantly, I got back in the car, telling myself to shake it off. It was just a ghost story, a bit of small-town lore, nothing more. I'd finish my shift, go home, and forget all about it. At 4:12 a.m., another ride request came in, from the same location. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the accept button. Against my better judgment, I pressed it. The GPS route appeared, leading me back down that same road, back toward the spot where he'd vanished. I knew I should just ignore it, but I couldn't shake the compulsion to go, as if something were drawing me back. When I pulled up to the same spot, there he was, standing beneath the streetlight, dark coat, hat pulled low, face half hidden. This time, he didn't get in the car. Instead, he looked directly at me through the windshield, eyes dark and empty. I felt frozen, trapped in his gaze, unable to look away. He raised one hand, slowly, and pointed down the road. "Take me home," he said, his voice echoing in my mind. I didn't remember deciding to drive. The next thing I knew, I was back on those twisting roads, the landscape around me unfamiliar and dark. The GPS had failed completely, and the car felt sluggish, the engine making a low, rumbling sound. Where is home?" I stammered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond. He just sat there, staring forward, unblinking. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, the road winding and endless. The clock read 4:33 a.m., but the sky showed no sign of light. It was like I'd fallen into a void, a night that would never end. Finally, the road came to an abrupt stop at a steep, fog-shrouded cliff. The car idled as I stared, heart pounding into the emptiness below. "I can't go any farther," I whispered, glancing at him in the mirror. He looked at me then, eyes gleaming, almost sad. "Neither can I," he said softly, and just like before, he vanished. I don't remember driving back to town, but at some point, I found myself outside the gas station again, my car parked under the same streetlight. The clerk was gone, and dawn was just beginning to break over the horizon. I checked the rideshare app. No fare logged, no evidence that the lost passenger had ever been there. But as I sat there, exhausted and numb, a new ride request pinged on my phone. The location was just past the edge of town. I took a deep breath, the familiar scent of asphalt and exhaust filling my lungs. "My name is Ethan Miller, and this is my life." Parking lot attendant for the night shift. The hours were long, and the solitude could be suffocating, but I had grown accustomed to the routine. Every night was the same. I would clock in, grab my flashlight, and start my rounds. Most nights I'd barely see a soul, just a few late-night shoppers or the occasional straggler from the nearby diner. But tonight felt different. The air was heavy, thick with a tension I couldn't quite place. As I walked the rows of parked cars, I glanced toward the far end of the lot. My heart sank. There, standing beneath the flickering streetlight, was a figure. It stood motionless, staring directly at me. I squinted, trying to make out the details. The figure was cloaked in shadows, its features indistinguishable, but I felt an unsettling chill creep down my spine. I shook my head, dismissing it as a trick of the light. Maybe it was just another late-night shopper waiting for a ride. After a few minutes of my routine checks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stole glances toward the figure, but it remained still, almost statue-like. Something about it felt wrong. I tried to shake off the creeping dread, telling myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. As I rounded the corner of the building, I caught sight of the figure again. It was closer now, standing just at the edge of the lot, its dark outline blending with the shadows. I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. It was as if it were moving closer every time I turned away. "Okay, this is getting weird," I muttered under my breath. I flipped on my flashlight and began walking toward it. Each step felt heavy, my heart pounding louder with every passing second. The light beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the ground in front of me, but as I approached, the figure remained obscured in shadows. When I was about 30 feet away, I called out, "Hey, are you lost?" My voice echoed in the stillness of the lot, but there was no response. The figure stood completely still, its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying me. I took another step forward, and to my horror, the figure shifted ever so slightly. It felt like it was mirroring my movements, as if it were an extension of me, reflecting my every action. I halted, feeling a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "This isn't funny," I called out again, irritation mingling with fear. I took a deep breath, summoning the courage to confront whatever this was. I couldn't let a shadow scare me, but as I stepped closer, the figure retreated, only to advance toward me when I turned away. It was a cruel game, and I was the unwilling participant. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and I began to pace back and forth, trying to shake off the paranoia. I kept glancing back toward the figure, watching as it seemed to inch closer with every fleeting moment. I broke into a jog, my pulse racing. The fear was palpable now, a dark presence stalking me from the edges of my reality. "Enough!" I shouted, my voice shaking with anger and fear. I turned abruptly, aiming to confront it once and for all. My flashlight beam caught the figure just as it froze in place, the light flickering against its outline. I felt a strange sense of recognition wash over me, but I couldn't place why. Then it happened. I blinked, and the figure was closer. So close I could make out its features. My breath caught in my throat. It looked exactly like me. Staring back at me were empty eyes, devoid of life or emotion. My heart raced as I took a step back, my mind reeling. "No, this can't be real," I whispered, the shock paralyzing me. It was as if I were looking into a mirror, but this reflection was twisted and wrong. "Who are you?" I demanded, but the figure remained silent, its gaze boring into me. My mind raced, and I stumbled backward, terror clawing at my insides. I turned to run, desperate to escape this surreal nightmare. But as I sprinted away, the world around me began to blur. The lights flickered, the air thickened, and my vision narrowed. I couldn't tell if I was running towards safety or deeper into the abyss. The darkness closed in, and I felt an overwhelming force pulling me back. The last thing I remember was the sensation of falling, as if the ground had vanished beneath my feet. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness and everything faded to black. When I finally came to, I was lying on the cold asphalt, disoriented and gasping for breath. The fluorescent lights above flickered harshly, and the familiar smell of the parking lot surrounded me, but something was off. I struggled to my feet, confusion clouding my mind. The lot was empty, void of life. I glanced down, expecting to see my reflection in the shiny surface of a car. But I was met with a chilling sight, my own body moving in the distance. I watched, paralyzed with fear, as my body went through the motions of the night shift. It walked the rows of parked cars, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The eeriest part was the blank expression on my face, a hollow shell performing tasks I was no longer a part of. What the hell is happening? I muttered, panic rising within me. I felt a pull, a connection to my body, but I was unable to reach it. I was trapped in this empty shell of an existence, forced to watch as my former self carried on, unaware of my presence. I stumbled backward, trying to comprehend the horror of my situation. I was a ghost, a watcher in a world that had moved on without me. The figure that had haunted me was now me, an echo of my own existence trapped in the shadows of the parking lot. Hours seemed to pass as I floated near the edge of the lot, helplessly observing my body continue its routine. I could see my mouth move as I muttered to myself, checking in on the empty rows of cars, flipping on the flashlight, and jotting notes on a clipboard. Despair settled in my chest. Is this my fate? I thought, to be forever a spectator in my own life. I tried to scream, to reach out to my body, but nothing came out. It continued to work, and I could only watch. Each time my body turned away, I felt that same sensation from before. The figure moving closer, the eerie sense of being hunted. Finally, as dawn approached, I felt a shift. The sky began to lighten, and the parking lot transformed as the first rays of sunlight broke through the darkness. My body paused, as if sensing the change, and for a brief moment, the expression on my face morphed from emptiness to confusion. Then I noticed a figure approaching from the far end of the lot. My heart raced as I recognized it. The familiarity of its stance, the way it moved, it was unmistakable. It was me. As my body stood still, the figure drew closer, and I felt a rush of hope mingled with fear. Maybe this time I could reach out, make contact, and pull myself back into reality. The figure paused, tilting its head just like I had done countless times before. Then, with a voice that echoed in the silence of the parking lot, it asked, "Hey, are you lost?" The loneliness of working the night shift is something you can't shake. It's a feeling that settles into your bones, especially in a place like this, a small, isolated gas station on the edge of town, illuminated by flickering fluorescents and surrounded by empty roads that stretch into darkness. I was only a few hours into my shift, scrolling through my phone, half watching the door, when the bell chimed. I looked up, expecting to see a late-night trucker or a regular customer looking for coffee or cigarettes. But no one walked in. The door just slowly creaked open on its own and then closed again, the bell's soft ding fading into silence. I waited for a second, trying to see if someone was there, but there was nothing, just me and the quiet hum of the building. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was probably just the wind, but as the night wore on, that uneasy feeling didn't fade. If anything, it got stronger. It was around 1:30 when I went outside for a smoke. There's something about standing alone in the empty lot at night that makes your skin prickle, but I figured a cigarette would help calm my nerves. I had barely taken a few puffs when I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel behind me. I spun around, expecting to see a customer, but no one was there. Just the empty lot, silent under the mist. I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me. My hands shook as I stubbed out my cigarette and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. I was about to sit down when I saw it, a dark, sticky smudge on the floor near the door, like a smeared footprint or a handprint. It was glossy and slick, and when I bent down to wipe it up, I felt a shiver go down my spine. Whatever left that mark, it didn't seem like anything I wanted hanging around. I tried to get back into my routine, scrolling through my phone, but every so often, my eyes would drift to the door. The longer I sat there, the more tense I felt. It was a little after 2:30 when the lights flickered, just a quick, sudden flash like a power surge. But in that moment, I saw something, a dark figure standing just beyond the pumps. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. I tried to brush it off as a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the image. I kept my eyes fixed on the lot, scanning the shadows, but it was empty, silent. A cold dread was building in my stomach, and I was starting to wonder if I'd make it through the night. A few minutes later, the door chimed. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest, but this time, someone actually walked in. A tall guy in a dark hoodie shuffled in, moving slow and stiff. He didn't say anything, just walked toward the cooler and grabbed a bottle of water. He set it down on the counter, his hood casting his face in shadow, and I felt a chill as he pulled out a crumpled dollar bill with long, pale fingers. They looked wrong, like they were too thin, almost skeletal. I rang him up in silence, handing him his change as fast as I could, and watched as he shuffled back out. He paused at the door just for a second, looking back at me with these empty, dark eyes. Then he was gone, disappearing into the night. I stood there for a minute, frozen, unable to shake the feeling that he wasn't really human. The next night, I told myself it was just a one-off, some creepy guy passing through. But around the same time, the door chimed again, and there he was, the man in the dark hoodie, standing in the doorway, just watching me. This time, he didn't move. He just stood there, eyes fixed on me, not saying a word. I tried to ignore him, going back to my phone, but I could feel his gaze burning into me, heavy and cold. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and left, the door closing softly behind him. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and I didn't sleep at all when I got home that morning. I kept telling myself he was just a drifter, some weirdo passing through, but every nerve in my body was screaming that there was something more to it, something dark. The same thing happened the next night and the night after that. Every time he'd show up around the same hour, standing there with those hollow eyes watching. I even tried calling the cops, but by the time they arrived, he was long gone, and they found no trace of him. They told me it was probably just some homeless guy, harmless, but they didn't see what I did. They didn't feel his gaze. I was starting to dread my shifts, feeling like each night brought me closer to something. I began to see him in every shadow, feel him lurking behind me, like he was always there, waiting. I started questioning my sanity, wondering if he was even real, or if he was something my mind had conjured in the lonely hours of the night. The last night I worked there, I almost didn't go in. I thought about calling in sick, quitting, anything to avoid that place. But I convinced myself to go, telling myself it was all in my head. But when he came that night, he didn't just stand in the doorway. He walked in, moving closer and closer until he was right in front of me, so close I could feel his cold, damp breath. I forced myself to look up, meeting his gaze, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. His eyes were empty, hollow, like two black voids that seemed to swallow the light. I felt myself sinking into them, like I was being pulled into some endless darkness. Then, he reached out, his cold, skeletal hand wrapping around my wrist, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the gas station, the lights flickering, and the door hanging open. I don't know how long I was out, but the only sign of him was a dark smudge on the floor, sticky and black. I quit that day. But every night, I still feel his gaze, like he's watching from the shadows, waiting for the next time I'll be alone.